We've historically overestimated Russia's military capabilities, and it's still continuing today. And you find countless examples of people saying that Russia should be able to do something on the battlefields of Ukraine, and then they just can't or don't. Now, there's a recent article in Foreign Affairs titled "What the West Still Gets Wrong About Russia's Military" that I thought was worth diving into. And one thing I couldn't believe they get into was the ratio of casualties from some of the poor regions in Russia to Moscow. It's crazy how out of sync that actually is. In the article, they say for decades, Western analysts and policymakers have consistently overrated Moscow's military strength. In part, this has been a result of lack of reliable information, which is going to be the case with most militaries around the world, right? You don't want to share all of the details of your capabilities, and there's a value in presenting strength when you may not actually meet those same capabilities. They say, but another factor beyond just, the not fully available information as to Russia's strength may be even more important. In assessing Russia's strength, U.S. and other Western experts have tended to focus on quantitative assessments of weapon systems, tanks, planes, and missiles, and raw manpower, rather than on the qualitative and psychological characteristics that often determine a military's performance on the battlefield. Common sense, right? The military is not just made up of the equipment they have at their disposal, but how well can they operate it? How well can they operate that equipment in a contested environment? What does the chain of command look like? What is the leadership like? What is the morale? All of those things. We've talked about that before in previous episodes here. It's very, very hard to measure that, right? But they push back and say, we've done it before. The West is actually acutely aware of qualitative issues when assessing other militaries. Take the cases of Kuwait, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia. Although their per capita defense outlays are among the highest in the world, few analysts would rank the effectiveness of their armed forces at a similar level. So it's a Russia problem, right? We somehow are able to figure that out with other militaries and look at their, some of these countries mentioned, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and Kuwait, have some of the most advanced military technology in the world because it's our military technology. And they're using that and they're trained on it. But we don't look at any one of those and think that they are on the verge of having the military capacity to take over the region on their own, per se, right? But somehow when it comes to Russia, we look at their capabilities and simply with that data point, say this military is the second strongest in the world. They say the overestimation of Moscow's military goes back to at least the mid-20th century. Following World War II, experts often overrated Soviet forces. They say that most of this kind of came to a halt at the end of the Cold War when most Western security experts fully appreciated the decline of the Russian military after the failure of the Soviet war in Afghanistan and the collapse of the Soviet Union. So essentially they were overhyped throughout the Cold War. We maybe expected, again, this isn't talking about their nuclear capabilities and their overall force projection. I don't know, I think this doesn't get into those aspects, but some of their nuclear capabilities were overhyped. But what this is really focused on is their actual military in a conventional setting, right? Tanks, aircraft, submarines, things like that. They say that many concluded after the fall of the Soviet Union and Russia kind of started to stand back up and instituted some of these reforms, that Russia's military had developed powerful new weapons, improved training, and become an effective fighting force that could pose a serious challenge to the world's top armies. And if we think about that, it's kind of crazy how quickly we went from 0 to 60 there, right? A superpower, the Soviet Union, which we kind of knew at the time we were overestimating in a lot of capacities, collapses, splinters apart, and then somehow in the following 10, 20 years, we look at them again and say, this is now an elite force on the world stage. It feels weird when you put it like that, doesn't it? They say by 2022, most analysts believed that by possessing one of the largest standing armies in the world and having equipped it with a variety of sophisticated weapon systems, Russia would inevitably have a natural advantage over Ukraine's much smaller defense forces. I don't think that's crazy. Again, very, very hard to measure those intangibles on the battlefield and the size of Russia's military. Size matters. There is a degree to which that's important in a conflict. And it's not just the number of people in uniform, but how many aircraft can you go through? How many tanks? How many rounds of artillery ammunition? So just looking at those, stacking Russia against Ukraine, it's not crazy that people looked at that and said Russia should come out of this quickly and on top. But the article points to 4 reasons that we got this wrong. We, the General West, got this wrong at the start of the war. They say, first, Western military observers have tended to rest their assumptions on flawed evidence. For instance, many seem to interpret Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014 and its intervention in Syria in 2015 as demonstrations of the success of its post-2008 defense reforms. In Crimea, however, there was almost no fighting, and some of the local population was pro-Russia. And in Syria, Russia's air force could carry out major bombing campaigns in the virtual absence of air defenses. In other words, these conflicts said little about how Russian forces would perform in a conventional land war. Now, I have to push back on that just a little bit because we're not going to look at World War II as an example of how Russia would fare against Ukraine in 2022. That's not valuable in this context, right? So there's not a lot of places. You have to look back in a certain window of time, looking even to the Soviet Union or into the conflicts in the 90s and the early 2000s. They're suggesting wasn't worthwhile because these reforms hadn't gone through. Things like Chechnya, not worthwhile because the reforms hadn't taken place. But looking at Syria and the Donbass and Crimea, what else can you look at when you're trying to measure the Russian military, right? Those were not all-out wars. They were not total wars like we're seeing in parts of Ukraine right now. So I think it's fair to say that more weight might have been added to those when assessing Russian capabilities, but they had to have been looked at in some way, shape, or form, right? Continuing on, they say, second, Western analysts have been too ready to take information coming out of Russia at face value. Russian reports about its large-scale military exercises convinced many security experts that Moscow's army had vastly improved its logistics, communication systems, air support of ground operations, and more generally, joint operations between different branches of the armed forces. So, it's something that I feel like we get right with other countries. When we watch North Korea conduct certain exercises, there's very few people, serious analysts, that look at that and say, it looks like North Korea's figured out air-land integration for combined arms operations. Instead, we look at it and say that was 100% staged, choreographed, and we're just seeing the highlight reel, if you will. But somehow, when it came to Russia, they would put on similar exercises, and then the takeaway would be, looks like Russia has it figured out. They say that a third problem relates to the nature of contacts between the Russian military and security experts and their colleagues in the United States and NATO in the years before the war. They say these relationships, these Russian experts, cultivated ties to the West, but the experts tended to be westernized, multilingual, and smart, but they also had close ties to the Kremlin and supported official Russian narratives. So, how much weight can you place again on what you're getting from the military itself? If we were to sit down with Chinese military officers right now in the United States, they come to the Pentagon, how forthcoming are they going to be and how transparent are they going to be with the challenges and the strengths in their force? So you can't expect much honesty there at baseline for an adversarial country. Even when the relationship was not as adversarial as it is today, Russia and the United States have not been the best of friends for a long, long time. So you have to at least view that with a little skepticism, and it makes it seem like maybe that wasn't there. Finally, they say, but no less important, U.S. military experts have long given too much focus to weapon systems and new technology in Putin's Russia. Observing these staged events, these staged training exercises, many Western observers concluded that Russia was building a modern, professional, and effective army. So again, we look at other countries doing something similar, North Korea, China even, sometimes coming out of Iran, not as many. Iran does it with some of their technology, not as much with like troop exercises. And we look at that and we write it off. It's choreographed, it's staged, it's pre-planned. It's not reflective of how this organization would operate in combat. But then Russia does the same thing, launches some new submarine or puts forward some new type of drone or missile, and it was accepted. This is just where Russia is right now. And in retrospect, that wasn't always the case. They dig in here to some of the major challenges that the Russian military faces now and going forward. And it brought up some aspects and some statistics here that I thought were pretty interesting. They referred to the Russian military as a motley crew, saying that the inherent weakness in Russia's armed forces have much to do with the way that its manpower is organized, which is a hybrid system of voluntary contractors, so people that go down to the office and enlist and say, I want to be a part of the military, and conscripted soldiers. Not really any news there. They say by March 2020, the Russian military was made up of approximately 405,000 contract soldiers, so full-time soldiers, and 225,000 conscripted soldiers, many of whom were poorly trained. These figures were unlikely to have significantly changed before the invasion. That puts the total force posture for the Russian military in the lead up to the invasion of Ukraine at 630,000 on or about. I think that is consistent with what we heard when the war kicked off. They added that one of the challenges here, this structure that Russia has adopted, the heavy mix of full-time and conscripted soldiers, leads to a challenge in their non-commissioned officer ranks. Now, the non-commissioned officers in the United States and quite a few Western militaries are kind of the backbone of the force. They're the doers. They're the ones on the front lines, really help execute the tasks that the officers help to plan. It's a very important job. It is hard for me to imagine my time in the Army doing any job that I had without quality NCOs. We couldn't have done it. We couldn't have functioned, right? It's very, very important. They say in Russia's case, however, there are relatively few professional, well-trained NCOs for which Russia tends to use contractors. Moreover, Russia's senior officers tend to refuse to delegate authority, robbing their younger colleagues of the chances to develop initiative and leadership qualities. So you're kind of getting it from both ends here, right? You've got the lack of NCOs at baseline, so you don't have that tip of the spear leadership that's necessary in a lot of fights. And then the officers aren't willing to delegate any sort of authority so that people down the chain can make decisions. So you're not going to build an NCO corps when all the authority is held with the officers. And one of the things they say is this became pretty clear in the opening days of the invasion. They say Russia's soldiers lacked guidance and discipline, and the refusal to delegate authority meant that high-ranking officers, including generals, were actively leading troops to the front, suffering numerous casualties. And if you remember back to the opening days of the war, there were like trackers going out there talking about the number of Russian generals that had been killed, and a lot of us in the West are pointing to that saying, this is a problem. Like, how on earth is Russia losing generals at this rate? Even colonels, lieutenant colonels. It's a very different war, of course, Ukraine, than what we experienced in the United States and Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria. 100% a different conflict. But the number of generals killed in a short period of time at the opening of the conflict was staggering. There's nothing we can point to in modern history where that was comparable, and this is the reason. It starts with the lack of quality NCOs. Getting into the quality of the force, they refer to the Russian military as rural, poor, and old. They say soldiers' pay has also distorted the composition of the army. To maintain recruitment since the war in Ukraine began, the government has made participation in the armed forces far more lucrative than it was before the invasion. By early 2023, the state was offering up to $2,600 per month for those willing to enlist, a salary that is several times over what ordinary people earn in small-town Russia. So $2,600 per month, early 2023, for those that walk down to the office, sign the papers, and say, I want to be a part of the military. Now, one of the things they talk about is how historically a lot of people that sign up for the military come from a few different walks of life, if you will. On the one hand, you've got people that want to serve their country. They're seeking adventure. They want to get away from home. That sense of patriotism, maybe, right? That makes up a portion of people that join any military. On the other hand, you have those that are looking for a way out. They're looking for a step up the economic ladder, something that'll pay better, get a roof over their head, 3 meals a day kind of thing. So you're really pulling from both of those buckets. We do in the United States too, right? We've got people coming in for a myriad of reasons. But they say that a problem right now is that those wages haven't kept up with inflation. So the contract soldiers that are coming in volunteering to fight, they're not coming uniformly from across the country. They're only now coming from the increasingly impoverished regions. So you're starting to see this skew where the people voluntarily joining the Russian military, it's not uniform across the country. You're getting more and more people from some of the poorest areas of the country. And with that comes people that are older trying to sign up, right? If they're trying to earn a wage for their family and provide for their family, that's just as necessary at 38 as it is maybe in their early 20s. So you're seeing older people coming from poorer areas and some of the rural portions of the country flocking to the military, much more so than you do those living in an area like St. Petersburg or Moscow. They add that a significant portion of its current manpower, about 1/3, comes from conscripts. And eligibility for conscription has been expanded from men between 18 and 27 to between 18 and 30. Not crazy. And the Duma has extended the maximum age at which reservists can be mobilized to 55 in the case of junior officers and 70 for the most senior officers. 70 in the military sounds really old. To add a little context, that is older than we have here in the United States. We are at a peacetime military right now, so take that into consideration. But the retirement age, there's a forced retirement age. I want to say it's 64 for officers, for senior officers, and you can apply for an extension, and you might get up to 66, 67. It's younger than 70, but not by a lot. They say, according to Russian accounts, these measures have produced the desired results. Thus, the June 2023 call-up supposedly yielded 140,000 conscripts, and volunteers have signed 117,000 new contracts in the first month of the year. But some analysts, including Russian experts in exile, have estimated that the real numbers are likely far lower, perhaps even less than half those figures. So again, getting back into the challenges of understanding the strength and the capabilities of the Russian military, we're getting these loose numbers as to how many people are actually signing up, but people observing that are saying that might not be anywhere near accurate. It could be as many as it could be as few as half of those are actually entering service. On top of that, the challenge of understanding how many people Russia has available for the fight is tied to their reporting of casualties. They say since September 2022, when Putin's government announced the unrealistically low figure of 5,937 Russian combat deaths, the Kremlin has offered no new data on Russian casualties. So no new data now in the past year on Russian casualties. They say U.S. officials estimated Russian war dead at 50,000 in May 2023. CSIS, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, put it at 60 to 70,000 in the first year of the war alone. And then a Russian outlet, Media Zona, put it at 47,000, saying that that's how many had died in the war in Ukraine. And that's not getting into casualties, how many were wounded and unable to return to the battlefield. The bottom line is that number is all over the place. And it's hard to understand the Russian troop strength when we don't know the number that are going in, and we don't know how many are coming out, either in body bags or back home to hospitals or whatever, and can no longer be in the fight. They say the Russian military's lackadaisical attitude toward casualties is demonstrated in its general neglect of combat medicine. So this isn't just talking about the tactical aspects on the battlefield, but this plays very much into the strength of an overall force. You'll hear why in a second. They say in the case of Russia, army doctors have been woefully under-equipped and are often able to offer little more than first aid. This helps account for the dramatically lower survival rate of Russian casualties, where Ukraine has a wounded to killed ratio of 7 to 1, so 7 soldiers are wounded for every 1 that ends up dying. For Russia, it remains just 3 to 1. Now, I can't say those numbers are 100% accurate when the whole thing leading up to this is we don't have very good numbers of anything. So take that with a grain of salt. It might be hard to dial that in. If we were confident in that 7 to 1 or 3 to 1 ratio, we might be more confident in casualty estimations. But if that's anywhere near accurate, 3 to 1 is rough. That's very, very low. That means that a lot of people that get wounded are eventually dying. They say likely just as damaging to the military's overall morale is the unequal demographics of who is getting killed. A wildly disproportionate number of those dying have come from the country's ethnic minorities and rural populations. According to independent news outlets, for every Muscovite, somebody from the Moscow region, who dies fighting this war, more than 87 die who come from Dagestan, 275 from Buryatia, a republic in the Russian Far East, and 350 who come from Tuva, home to an Asian minority in Russia's poorest region. So 350 people are dying from Tuva for every one person that dies from Moscow. So you can see where the possibility for a split inside of Russia is here. And I don't know if that'll ever happen, but the vast majority of these casualties are coming from ethnic minorities and the economically depressed regions of the country. I don't know that anything will ever happen due to that, but you can understand how unrest, political unrest, economic unrest could kind of boil up when some areas of the country are experiencing significantly more casualties than anyone else. In wrapping up, they talk about what we can do to not make these same mistakes when assessing Russian military strength going forward. They say the Russian military's performance in Ukraine has not met the expectations of Western analysts, but those expectations were not based on realistic assumptions. The enduring misconception among Western analysts and officials of Russia's military strength has serious consequences. Uncritical acceptance of reports and data emanating from Moscow encouraged many to believe in the inevitability of Russia's eventual victory. And I think that's fair. I think it's declining over time, but I still see a lot of reports and a lot of assessments talking about how it's just a matter of time until Russia gets it together and figures it out and is able to crush the Ukrainian forces. And the evidence isn't really there on the battlefield, right? The fact that it's a stalemate, to me, shows how capable the Ukrainian forces have been in a lot of aspects of this war, because Russia does maintain an advantage. It doesn't mean the Russian military is better, but they have an advantage in terms of quantity, and quantity matters, especially when you're talking about an attritional style war. So the fact that Ukraine has been able to turn this into a stalemate and advance in portions of the South, Russia's eventual victory is in no way, shape, or form guaranteed. They say by recognizing and ignoring Russian propaganda and instead studying and identifying the actual vulnerabilities of Russia's military, the United States and its allies may be able to develop new and better approaches that could allow them to help Ukraine prevail and to hasten the end of the war, just as the United States did with the Soviets' war in Afghanistan. So, of course, the context of this article and the reason that it's getting attention is because it's tied to the ongoing Russian war in Ukraine. But the way I look at a lot of these things is how can the United States leverage some of this information for our own benefits going forward? Should it mean a future conflict with Russia or another, war like this where Russia's fighting an ally of the United States? And the big things that really stood out to me was just the force structure and the quality in the Russian military, along with the disproportionate casualties being suffered in some of the areas of Russia. I don't know exactly what can be done to leverage that and to take advantage of that rift going forward, but they're pretty noticeable, right? Especially compared with a lot of Western militaries. There's very noticeable differences in force quality now and potentially into the future. So, something to keep an eye on. As always, I will link the article in the description below, along with a link to the national security sit reps I put out on Substack. It's an email direct to your inbox once a week with 7 to 10 of the biggest national security stories of that week, along with some podcast recommendations. But thanks for watching. I'll see y'all next time.